Krisztina Rozgonyi bitten, die gleich auf die Bühne kommt. Sie ist Senior Scientist am Austrian Institute of Technology, forscht zu Plattform-Governance, KI-Ethik, Medienpolitik und gesellschaftlichem Wandel und hält uns einen Gastvortrag zu Beginn auf Englisch.
Danke.
Dankeschön.
Aber nehmen Sie auch Platz, vielleicht die Panelisten, oder? Okay. Vielen herzlichen Dank für die Einladung. Wir haben abgemacht, dass ich diesen Spark Talk auf Englisch abhalten werde, weil das ist mein Working Language. Und ja, okay. So I will be talking about sovereignty and the freedom of communication, and especially about who owns our means of knowing. In recent years, I would say the concept of sovereignty has re-emerged in political, economic, and technological debates across Europe. Sovereignty, which is the supreme authority of a state to govern itself without external interference, encompasses both internal sovereignty and internal control over its territory in the very old-fashioned traditional sense, over people, but also external independence from other political powers, namely the ability to decide and to act independently. Today, that autonomy depends on digital infrastructures, the networks, the platforms, the clouds, and protocols that carry communication. Whoever controls these infrastructures indirectly controls what can be said, heard, and coordinated. Just as roads enable the movement of people and goods for trade and political control, and parliaments provided the framework for debate and lawmaking, communication networks now serve as the vital channels for information, public opinion, and citizen participation necessary for a self-determining society. So we have, on the one hand, digital infrastructures. On the other hand, we also have something as much important, and that's knowledge. Because beyond infrastructure, sovereignty also depends on the systems that produce and validate knowledge. Search engines, AI models, data repositories, and media ecosystems. They shape how societies themselves, how they do know themselves, what they consider true, and whose perspectives are represented. So we could say that if infrastructure determines who can speak, knowledge systems determine what to be known. Together, these two layers form the conditions of a democratic society. And, of course, very importantly, agency. And we could say that when communication, the core process of public life, depends on privately owned infrastructures, or when information is filtered by opaque algorithmic systems, the question of sovereignty becomes a question of freedom of communication. Hence, my focus today is on these two interrelated questions. Basically, the two interrelated dimensions of our democracies: infrastructure and epistemic sovereignty. Both concern Europe's ability to maintain democratic autonomy in a rapidly changing digital environment. So let's start with infrastructure. The European Union has made digital or technological sovereignty a central strategic goal. In EU policy language, this refers to the Union's ability to set its own rules, control critical infrastructure and data, and reduce strategic dependencies while remaining open to cooperation and trade. You could say, in Brussels language, as many call it, open strategic autonomy. This concept there is an evolutionary path to this concept, I would say, from the beginning of the 20s. The early 2020s, the European Union acknowledged its dependence on non-European technology providers, particularly in cloud computing, semiconductors, and AI. Therefore, initiatives began to identify strategic technologies where Europe needed greater capacity. Then, the next phase I would call the post-COVID phase, because the pandemic exposed vulnerabilities, especially in the supply chains and digital services, highlighting how essential the digital infrastructure had become for education, health, and governance. And most recently, the focus is, and the concerns are about geopolitical tensions, cybersecurity, economic competitiveness, and they have reinforced the need for a more autonomous digital ecosystem. So what is Europe doing about that? How do we respond to that? Well, we have a lot of laws and a lot of regulations and a lot of policies and some initiatives as well. Just to name a few, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, since 2022, are strategic responses to these challenges. They are designed to limit the gatekeeping power of very large online platforms and ensure fairer conditions for digital competition and transparency. We also have the AI Act. That is meant to establish harmonized frameworks for trustworthy and risk-based regulation of various, especially high-risk artificial intelligence systems across Europe. Also, we have strategies, and I would definitely name the European Data Strategy as a key point here, which is meant to create common European data spaces and sectors in critical areas. And we also have investments, and especially investment initiatives to develop European cloud infrastructure, compute capacity, such as the AI Factory, which is just a few blocks from here, the Austrian one, or promote cybersecurity resilience. But, and there is a but, despite this progress, Europe remains highly dependent on a few global technology companies that control large parts of the communication infrastructure. And such concentration creates structural asymmetries. Gatekeeping power, first and foremost. A small number of platforms determine which information is accessible and visible, and their algorithms decide what gains attention and what is marginalized, influencing how public discourse unfolds. Secondly, economic imbalance. Media and smaller digital service operate within environments defined by these platforms' business models, affecting their financial sustainability and capacity for independent media production. You could name journalism. And thirdly, there are very important democratic implications. When communication channels are governed by private logics rather than public accountability, pluralism and freedom of expression become vulnerable. This situation illustrates a European paradox. While Europe has strong regulatory instruments, it still lacks an independently run and independently built infrastructure. In practice, we could also say the European public sphere operates on privately owned systems. And there is another layer to that, and that is artificial intelligence. The European regulation, including the AI Act, but also the Council of Europe's AI Convention, seeks to ensure that AI development respects human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. However, there are certain limitations to that. These legal frameworks primarily focus on individual rights, risk mitigation, and transparency. they are less suited to address structural issues such as concentration of infrastructure, economic dependencies, especially in the media sector, or the broader political economy of AI. Hence, we could say that the lack of sovereign digital infrastructure amplifies inequality and reduces symmetry, that reduces diversity in the information space. And let's get to the other part of the equation, knowledge. The second dimension is about what many calls epistemic sovereignty, namely the ability of societies to maintain agency over the processes by which knowledge and understanding are produced. In a functioning democracy, citizens must be able to access reliable information and to make informed choices. This presupposes what many academics call epistemic equality, namely equal access to knowledge, equal opportunities to interpret it, and the protection from systemic manipulation. Today, the conditions of knowledge formation are heavily mediated by digital technologies, especially AI systems. These systems shape what information appears relevant, credible, or authoritative. They do not merely transmit information, they structure how knowledge is generated and validated. Especially the so-called generative AI systems, which we know most from our everyday practice, can be understood as epistemic technologies. They collect, classify, and interpret data in ways that influence how people understand reality. This epistemic power of these technologies derives at least from two main factors. Control over training data. This is something you have definitely heard about a lot. So the data sets that are used to train AI models determine what perspectives, languages, contexts are represented. And if these data sets are limited or biased, the resulting models reproduce those distortions. Secondly, the control over output and the interfaces. The platforms that deploy AI systems decide how outputs are framed, filtered, or monetized. This shapes public understanding subtly but at scale. So I would say epistemic sovereignty refers to the capacity of individuals, of us, of communities, but also of nations, to influence and understand the process through which digital systems construct knowledge, including the ability to question, to audit, and to correct them. This creates something that is the risk of epistemic dependence. When epistemic infrastructures are privately owned and globally concentrated, there are several risks that emerge. Representation and bias, something I've already mentioned, but I should mention again and again. The perspectives of small languages, regions, cultures may be underrepresented in global datasets, reinforcing epistemic inequality. Loss of transparency, just to name another one. Proprietary models limit external scrutiny of how decisions and classifications are made. Thirdly, the decline of trust. If citizens cannot assess the reliability of AI-generated information, they don't know what is true, what is false, what is wrong, then public trust in so-called knowledge institutions, the media, academia, the government, deteriorates. These risks are not purely technical. They affect the democratic capacity to deliberate, to disagree, and to act on shared facts. So, what to do? I am definitely not going to answer this question. This is why we are here today. But just a few thoughts to spark the discussion of our panel. If we agree that the goal is not to close or isolate Europe technologically, but to ensure that societies retain the capacity to act, decide, understand on their own terms, then there is a need for several interventions. I would definitely add to this public investment in independent digital infrastructures. This is, again, something Europe already tries to put up, but it's not enough. Transparency, meaningful transparency and accountability mechanisms for large platforms and AI systems. Again, there are many interventions in this direction, but not enough. Support for media and research institutions to produce knowledge that sustain informed public debate. And obviously, education and literacy policies that enable citizens to navigate complex information environments critically. And to conclude, I would say the European project of digital sovereignty is not only an economic or technological agenda. It is a democratic one. It asks whether Europe can continue to guarantee the freedom of communication, not only as a right, but as a material and epistemic condition of self-government. Ultimately, it is what freedom of communication means today: the capacity to build and sustain the conditions under which a democracy can understand itself. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank.